And I understand it's just even modern ones are just this is great stuff.
Good evening, everyone. We would like to welcome back Dr. Gillian Steinberg as she continues her 3-lecture series on 20th century poetry and the sacred. Tonight's lecture is entitled Sacred Moments.
Okay, I got the mic right tonight. Thank you all so much for coming back. It was a pleasure to talk to you last week, and this week we're going to address 3 different poems. If you recall, when we were talking last week, we really focused on, I think, 3 poems that demonstrate a kind of modern tension with people being drawn to and pushed away from faith and religion sort of simultaneously, and feeling the need to be drawn back to something, even though in a sort of modern vein, they're feeling sort of skeptical, which is really a condition of modernity in some ways, to have a sense that you should be doubting, or that you're almost too sophisticated or too mature to believe. And yet we saw in each of those 3 poems last week that people who were very cool and distant also felt themselves really drawn to faith and looking for things in faith that they couldn't find elsewhere. And I think we see that across religious traditions, which is really what my work is on. I don't work primarily on Jewish poets. I work mostly actually on Christian poets. And I find that there are a lot of interesting overlaps, and it's especially interesting for me as a professor at Yeshiva University to teach Christian poets to our young men. I don't teach at Stern, I only teach at Yeshiva College. So, and how much the men are interested in it, and how much they find resonance actually in the experience of poets who come from a tradition that's different from theirs, and yet all of us being in the contemporary world together, I think we're all facing very similar kinds of challenges and tensions in our lives. So we saw that last time. What I've brought in today is 3 poems that I think take a different angle, and we'll look through and see if at the end of the hour we can draw some conclusions about what these 3 are doing and how they're addressing the modern condition a little bit differently. I think you'll still see some of those tensions and some of that pushing away and drawing towards, but by choosing poems that fit into this category of sacred moments, I've taken outside of literal holy places. Remember last week we had the synagogue and the Western Wall and the church, and instead of being in those holy places, these poems are about speakers finding holiness in moments that might not otherwise feel holy. And so it's moving to a new kind of place and actually finding holiness in time. So let's look at these. The first one is the one that is the least modern, both in terms of its date, which is technically right in the Victorian era, or a little bit past, and also in its content. But Gerard Manley Hopkins is often considered by scholars of poetry to be the first of the modern poets, and usually that's because of the style in which he writes as opposed to the content of his writing. And yet I think we'll see some things here that do resonate with what we saw last time. Listen to the language especially though, because it's really spectacular. This is called God's Grandeur. The world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. It gathers to a greatness like the ooze of oil crushed. Why do men then now not wreck his rod? Generations have trod, and all is seared with trade, bleared, smeared with toil, and wears man's smudge and shares man's smell. The soil is bare now, nor can foot feel being shod. And for all this, nature is never spent. There lives the dearest freshness deep down things. And though the last lights off the black west went, oh, morning at the brown brink eastward springs, because the Holy Ghost over the bent world broods with warm breast and with bright wings. So, like one of the poems we read last week, this is a sonnet. Again, it's a kind of love poem. But if you look at the first 8 lines, the octet, it's expressing this very modern idea that the world is not what it should be, and that we have lost our way and our sense of connection. And one of the things that Hopkins is particularly interested in is nature and natural imagery, and you see here that he's actually really disturbed by our disconnection from nature. You can see that in a number of places here, but I think most starkly maybe in the last lines of the octet. The soil is bare now, nor can foot feel being shod. That is, just our wearing of shoes separates from us from the earth, and we can't feel the soil. And even the soil has a bareness. And that bareness is coming from what he talked about just before, that everything is dirtied by our work, by human work, and the work of human hands, right? Generations have trod. You can see from this how much Hopkins likes repetition of sound and rhyme. In fact, he kept entire rhyming dictionaries where he would just write down words that rhymed, and he actually found that they had meanings that he felt were common. So sometimes my students especially have a lot of trouble reading Hopkins because he uses words in very unconventional ways. You can see it here when he does seared and bleared and smeared all together. Those do sort of have similar related meanings, but they're also different from each other, but he puts them together in ways that make them feel as though they work together. So what do you notice in the first 8 lines that suggests a separation, or that kind of modern condition that we're talking about, industrialization, the separation of people from their surroundings? Yes?
I think it's the word trade.
Okay.
I think that's what he's using to bring in a very, I mean, again, we talk about unpacking words.
Mm-hmm.
Trade is as you said, separation from nature.
Right.
It's a man-made set of constructs.
Right.
It's how should I say, degrading to the soul. I mean,
Yeah.
it's all these. I mean,
Right.
that's what he's implying.
Right, absolutely.
One word.
With one word, with just trade, right? It has to do, even that idea of man's smell, right? That we've sort of contaminated everything in the natural world, and in part it's because of work, because we have work to do, and we wear the world down with our work, and it pulls us away from the world as well. And trade has a very sort of useful sense, right? It's done for this purpose. Now, Hopkins was someone who actually separated himself from the world in many ways. And I know I talked about not getting too much into the biography, but he does some interesting things here because he hated work, but he also really wanted to serve. And so he was a priest, and he was very isolated, and lived in a monastery and taught, and he didn't enjoy teaching. I think he had terrible students from what it sounds like from his letters. He did not enjoy his students. It sounds like they were really being forced to study, but he was an expert in ancient languages, so he taught Latin and Greek, and he also was fluent in Hebrew and very familiar with Tehillim in the original, and you can see some of those things coming here too, just from the sound and the musicality of his language. But really, he separated himself from the world in a lot of ways and spent a lot of time observing nature and finding God in nature. And I think that you see that in the sestet, the last 6 lines, where we have a real switch in his tone. So what he's done is set us up with a kind of attitude at the beginning that, again, feels very like Wordsworth in some ways, right? Wordsworth says, I just lost the line. Give me a minute. He has a sonnet also that talks about separating ourselves, and that's going to drive me crazy. Okay, I'll think of it. And so Hopkins is sort of following in that, but then Hopkins has in the sestet what I would really call a sacred moment, where he looks at all of this negativity and what man has done to the world and our real separation from it. You know, he's really expounding on how terrible this is. This is a real problem for our spirituality. And then points something else out, which is, for all this, and there he means despite all this, nature is never spent, right? And so he's set up, in a way, this distancing, and then points out something almost miraculous that he notices in spite of the modern concern he has for our distance. And that miraculous thing is, it keeps coming back, right? Nature keeps regenerating itself. It keeps coming back. We've trod and trod and trod, and we have trade and our smell and our feet, right? All these sort of base images. And what he points out is there's a constant regeneration, and that regeneration comes from God. And so what's the holy moment here? Did you notice it? The language is so difficult that sometimes it can be hard to find. But in the sestet, what's the holy moment?
Assume the Holy Ghost.
It's an image that he uses, but he's actually talking about a moment. Can you see what it is?
Dawn.
Yes, the sunrise. That's right, he's talking about the sunrise. And that's this moment for him that in a way symbolizes or encapsulates the idea that there's this constant regeneration. So if you look at the way he describes it, I think it's spectacular, right? So he says, for all this nature is never spent. And then here's the explanation of how that's the case. It's such an unsyntactical line, no one would speak this way. There lives the dearest freshness deep down things. Something's missing from that line. There's like a pronoun missing, preposition is missing, like something's missing there that's making that line syntactically correct. And yet, I think, if you're willing to let go of syntax for a minute, you can still get the meaning there, right? There's something fresh in the deep down things. There's the dearest freshness in or deep in things, right? The things of the world. And then here's the description. What happened? Though the last lights off the black west went. What was that? Sunset, right? It's a perfect one to read now that we're in darkness for hours already at 8 o'clock, right? The last lights off the black west went. Oh, morning at the brown brink eastward springs. And so as soon as you have that moment of darkness for him, there's the light again, right? And that keeps happening. And so there's this very holy moment as he's facing the difficulty. And there it contrasts so much with Wordsworth. It's the world is too much with us, late and soon. Sorry. Where it contrasts with Wordsworth, who starts the poem with the world is too much with us, late and soon, and it sort of spirals into despair, and he ends by saying, I'd rather be a pagan, right? That's how Wordsworth ends that poem. I'd rather be a pagan than live with this kind of distance from nature. And so Hopkins sets us up with a very similar premise at the beginning, right? We're wearing down and we're not in connection with nature. And then he ends in an entirely different way. Not I'd rather be a pagan, but if you look around, you have to believe in God. Because look what you see. Every single morning, no matter what we do and how hard we try, there it is again, right? Yes?
I have a technical question.
Sure, no problem.
The author has gone to considerable trouble to develop rhyme.
Yes.
Foil, oil, toil,
Sure.
toil.
Yes.
And then in the second stanza,
Good.
spend,
Went, bent, yeah.
But when the lines don't end with punctuation, you
lose it.
did not emphasize that.
That's correct. Absolutely.
That's not the way to read.
So, I mean, I don't know that I want to be like a poetry dictator and tell you what the proper way to read is. I think you should read it the way that's meaningful to you, but I always read by the punctuation, not by the line breaks, and I think that that's what most scholars of poetry do. And then what you have the opportunity to do is exactly what you've done, which is hear it for its meaning, look back at it for its form. And so what you notice is all kinds of secret hidden things in there, whereas if you emphasize the end rhyme, when that's not where there's a syntactical break, you actually miss the meaning of the poem. So if I read, some of his lines do end there, but if I read, and wears man's smudge and shares man's smell, the soil is bare now, nor can foot feel being shod, you've lost the sentence, right? Because soil is the subject and is the verb. You need that together. The soil is bare now. But what you're meant to do with a poem, of course, is look at it again and again. And so you go back and you notice the rhyme. And it's not just the rhymes that you pointed out, it's all the internal rhyme too, right? He plays with sound in so many ways. One of the things that's very interesting about Hopkins, and that I've actually worked on, I'm writing an article at some point about this, is that he wrote little, almost musical markings in all his poems, because he wanted people's inflection to change based on his direction. So he used blue chalk in his notebooks, and he wrote what actually looks exactly like trope throughout the poems to signal a rise in inflection, a smoothness connecting one word to the next. Sometimes it'll go over one line and on to the next, like legato marking in music. And so he wrote those all over his poems. And unfortunately, when his poems are reproduced, most often those marks are left out. Every once in a while, you'll see one. Do you know Margaret, Are You Grieving, Over Golden Grove Unleaving? Have you heard that? Do you know that poem? So that's one of his most anthologized poems, and it's got like a little thing in Margaret, so you pronounce it. Everyone republishes that little thing for some reason, but he has those marks all over the place, and people, generally editors, leave them out. But I actually want to do some research to study whether he knew trope, because he knew so much about Judaism and so much about Hebrew, that it's actually possible he knew it and was modeling the way that poems should be read on like the way that Torah should be chanted. But I haven't found evidence of that yet, so it's on hold, but that's something that I'm working on. But I do think that there's actually good reason to read for meaning first, and when you read aloud, to read for meaning, and then to look back and see what's being done with the language, almost behind the scenes, because I think your ear picks up the subtleties of rhyme, even if I'm not thudding on them at the end of every line. Yeah.
We just did.
Oh, that time I did, yeah. That was unintentional. Yes, sir.
I think Gregorian chant, which he obviously
Right,
didn't know,
absolutely.
also has musical notation.
It does. It's a very different kind than what he used, though. He has marks that really look, some of them like trope marks. But many of them look like musical marks too, like the fermata or the legato. So it's hard to tell where each of those things came from, but the Gregorian chant marks are dots and lines that look different from what he used, but certainly he was familiar with that. He was so devoted to the writing of poetry that when he joined the monastery where he lived for most of his life, he burned all of the poems he'd written up till that point. So they're all lost. Because he felt that he needed to commit himself fully to God, and that the poetry was, as this poem suggests, keeping him too much in the world, that he was too worried about pride, and so he burned everything. And he only started writing poems again when a ship sank, the Deutschland, and he wrote a famous poem called The Wreck of the Deutschland at the request of the head of the monastery, who was a priest above him in rank, who knew that he had been a poet and asked if he would write a poem commemorating the loss, because there had been a number of nuns on the ship who were lost and they wanted a memorial poem for them. And that's when he started writing again. And it was so well received that he asked permission to continue to write, which he did, but he didn't publish one thing in his lifetime, not one. Because he didn't want to be taken out of his service to God. So I think, we think about poets as often being not such great people, pretty self-centered and often kind of insane. Especially I think in this era, I think about poets like Ezra Pound or T.S. Eliot, who were really kind of hateful people, even though they wrote wonderful poetry. And Hopkins is one antidote, I think, to that. A really fascinating and, I think, in a lot of ways, beautiful person. And his poetry was published after his death by a friend of his, Robert Graves, who was also a poet. And Hopkins had never asked for that to happen. He had no wish for personal fame or glory in any way. So I think that's very interesting too. And I think that gives you a sense when you're reading a poem like this, that he really didn't write for anyone to see, that you're seeing something very special about a moment that he experienced. One of the things that's interesting to me, and I don't know if this is true for you, is that my students respond very powerfully to this poem, even though it is an overtly Christian poem, at least at the end. And yet, I think it speaks to some experience that we've all had in feeling doubt or some wavering of faith or some looking around the world and seeing all the terrible problems, and then having another moment of saying, but there's so much that's beautiful or so much that's miraculous. And my students really respond to that, and they kind of leave the Holy Ghost part aside. But that's the image that he uses. And of course, the Holy Ghost, if you're familiar with, say, Renaissance art at all, you're familiar with that image of the bird, right? The hovering bird, which is usually a Holy Ghost image. So he's bringing that in a very specific bird way, right? To say that it's hovering over the world in this protective way, almost like a wing around the world. And that's what we see as the sun rises every morning. And I think that's that moment for him. And he wants it in some ways, even though he doesn't plan to have this published, he wants that to be a moment for everyone where you can look around and say, boy, things are bad. It's really bad. It's worse than it's ever been. And yet something about the world won't let it end, right? It just keeps coming back. So I think there's something really beautiful about that. And in some ways, this is, of all the poems we're going to do in the 3 weeks that I'm here, the least complicated emotionally of them, because it's a little bit of a setup, right? I mean, he knows when he starts where he's going to end. And he doesn't end in a place of terrific tension. I think he ends in a place of some calm and some peace. But I think that it's so instructive for us to see that too, because so many of us feel like we're stuck in the octet. There's something so beautiful about the sestet. I still want to look at 2 more, though, that do things that are a little bit more complicated and that are a little more contemporary. Yes, Michal?
I'm sorry to ask this since I'm sorry that I had to come in late.
No problem.
Maybe it was already discussed. But the concept of nature never being spent, was there evidence that Hopkins knew the davening? Because, it says that Kadesh B'chol Yom Tamid Ma'aseh Breshit. In other words, that God is always renewing.
I don't think that there's evidence that he knew that. I think that there's evidence that he knew all scripture. And in the original, in fact, there was a point, you probably know this, when to graduate from Oxford or Cambridge, you had to be fluent in Hebrew and you had to be able to read the Bible in the original. So as any educated person of his time would have been, he knew that. Whether he knew the davening, I don't think there's evidence. There's not even evidence that he knew a Jew. Right? So, I mean, he was a very isolated person, but even so, he wouldn't have had tremendous opportunity.
You just noted it because...
Yeah.
Yes.
But I think that it's also, it's not an unknown concept. So where he's getting it from, or whether it's just something that's occurred to him independently, I don't know. Good question, though. I'm not sure. Yeah.
Was Larkin Roman Catholic also? I meant to ask that last week.
Anglican.
He was Anglican.
Yeah, Anglican. And Hopkins was born Anglican and converted, and that was a very, obviously, important experience for him, and something that separated him from his family a bit, too. And so he remained close with his mother, but there was a divide in the family after his conversion.
Speaking of knowing Hebrew at Oxford, when I was there in the 50s at Corpus Christi College, if you violated one of the rules at dinner or lunch, you were penalized. You could protest in either Latin, Greek, or Hebrew.
Oh.
And several of the boys who happened to be yeshiva boys would protest
In Hebrew.
And the chaplain in each case overruled them because they had made either a vocabulary or a grammatical mistake.
Oh dear. That's a good story, though. Interesting. So that held on for a long time then, although I know people weren't required to be fluent in Hebrew at that point. Right? I think that went away a while ago.
And this was the chaplain.
Right. And the chaplain knew. Sure. Interesting. So the next poem that I brought in is a Yehuda Amichai poem. I'm very skeptical about bringing in translations, but this is such an amazing poem that I thought it was worth it. But it is originally a Hebrew poem. Are you all familiar with Amichai? So obviously, sort of the best known, I'd say one of the best of the 20th century Israeli poets. And I think that this is a very interesting poem because, again, of the moment that it captures, but it's a little bit more conflicted and maybe a little bit more difficult for us than God's grandeur. So let's look at this one. Jerusalem, 1967. On Yom Kippur, 5728, I donned dark holiday clothing and walked to Jerusalem's old city. I stood for quite a while in front of the kiosk shop of an Arab, not far from Shechem Gate, a shop full of buttons, zippers, and spools of thread of every color, and snaps and buckles, brightly lit and many-colored, like the open holy ark. I said to him in my heart that my father too owned a shop just like this, of buttons and thread. I explained to him in my heart about all the decades and the reasons and the events leading me to be here now, while my father's shop burned there and he is buried here. When I concluded it was the hour of Ne'ilah, he too drew down the shutters and locked the gate as I returned homeward with all the other worshipers. So I think this is a remarkable poem. I think it's really beautiful. It is a bit irreverent in a way because it is about the day when, like our speakers from last week, you should be in a holy place. And he has chosen to be in a different place. He's wearing his holiday clothes, but here he is, standing in front of an Arab shop and looking at the things that are in the window and remembering some things from his childhood. And so the suggestion here I think that Amichai is bringing is that you can find holiness anywhere, right? There's a particular resonance for him here, but you can find holiness anywhere, and it doesn't have to be in shul. But he's chosen sort of a touchy time to say, I'm praying in front of an Arab's shop. So I'll ask you, what do you think he's doing here? Why is he presenting this as a holy moment? Yeah.
I was puzzled by the ambiguity of the third person pronoun. When he talks about him and he,
Yep.
originally it seems like he's talking to God in his heart.
Yeah.
Then we talk about that he closed the shutters.
Right.
So we talk about the Arab.
Yes.
And
Well,
I suspect that was deliberate.
I think so, and I gotta tell you, it works a lot better in Hebrew than in English, because what we lose here is, I have to choose when I do the translation, right? Lowercase h or capital H. But you don't have that problem in Hebrew. So there, what?
Well, then you really don't know.
I think that that's better, though. I think it works much better if you don't know, right? The problem here is, like, it wasn't me who translated, but this particular translator has chosen the lowercase h, which says something. It like pins down the meaning a bit. But Amichai is really very intentionally going for that ambiguity. Who is the he? That works in Hebrew too. I meant who, WHO is the he. And when he says, I explained to him in my heart, that's the suggestion that this is a prayer. This isn't, he's speaking to the Arab in his heart, although it's certainly possible that that's a secondary meaning, that he's speaking to this Arab shop owner in his heart. He doesn't say it out loud, but explaining, my father had a shop like that too. And so the connection that we may be finding here in this holy moment is a connection to another human being, right? Who's supposed to be different but has this similarity. And in 67, that's meaningful too. But I think there's also a suggestion that the he really is God, because when it says, the one you pointed out, that he draws the shutters and locks the gate, it says he too, right? Gamhu. So if he's also doing it, then who's the also, right? You can't do also if there's not someone else doing it. And so when he says he too drew down the shutters and locked the gate, that really could be either one. And I think the implication, of course, and that's the implication, right? That he's saying to us, they both did, right? God and this man, right? Both. Yeah.
Maybe I'm missing something.
Okay.
First of all, dark holiday clothing on Yom Kippur
Right.
is a confusion of symbols, because if anything, you'd be wearing white.
Yes.
A kittel or white clothing or something of that nature. So I'm not really sure what.
Right. So I think that that's intentional too, but we can think about why. Yeah.
But the rest of this, I get the sense of political conflict. I don't see much religion in this at all.
Really? Oh, interesting.
I see this, he's basically, he's trying to figure out how, to me, he's trying to figure out how to explain to this Arab why he is in this place supplanting, in many ways, this Arab. That his father had such and such, and he would still be there if he had not been thrown out.
Right.
So except for the location, which I'm sure is not, just a happenstance, I'm getting more of a political feel out of this than a religious one.
Really? And even though it's connected to Ne'ilah and to Yom Kippur?
I think that's a very clever imagery.
Okay.
I mean,
But you don't think there's anything spiritual about that imagery?
No. I mean, I see a gate literally closing, just as Ne'ilah.
Right.
It depends on how you feel about Yom Kippur as to how you feel about Ne'ilat HaShar.
Right.
But here, I see a shutter coming down.
Interesting. How about reading the word worshipers at the end there, with all the other worshipers, which I think includes him among worshipers? I think that's part of why I read it as being a religious poem, because he describes himself ultimately as being a worshiper, but he's doing it in an unusual way, in a strange place. But he also describes the open windows of the shop as the Aron Kodesh, right? I mean, that's the language in the poem.
Why would he do this? What is there about a shop? I mean, think back to the concept of trade in the previous.
Right. It's very different use of trade. It's a great point when you compare the trade, but I think look, this is my reading, and one of the things that's great about poetry is we can have different readings and go back and forth, and what we can do is keep looking back to the text to say, well, this word says this, but what about this word? And multiple meanings. So my reading of that is that he is describing a kind of davening that's an alternate davening. Maybe it's dark instead of light. It's in front of a store instead of in front of an aron. But each of those images is meant to parallel the davening. And when he says that he's a worshiper going home with all the other worshipers, I think he's suggesting that he's done what they've done, but in this different way. And I think that it's also, if you think about what's inside the shop and what's inside the aron, right? His Torah, in a way, is what he describes in the middle paragraph here, which is that history and that connection to his father and that childhood lost, right? And that's sort of the Torah that he's saying here.
I think I missed the word worshipers. So
Okay.
that
Does it change a little?
recasts.
Okay, you can keep thinking about it. Yeah, in the back.
No, I agree with you 100%. I know a little bit about Ron Michael. I read some of his stuff. I read about it.
Yes.
And I think it's important to know a little bit about his biography.
Okay.
He was born in Germany.
Yes.
He grew up in a strictly Orthodox home. He went to shul. He describes around how he goes to shul all the time with his father. Once he came to Palestine, he became non-religious. And I think that conflict between his coming from a real Orthodox home, not just a Jewish home, an Orthodox observant home, and what he is now, and that's always this conflict in his mind. And that conflict comes to the fore here too.
Right.
So there is a religious meaning to it because he doesn't know how to deal with it anymore. He was
Interesting.
religious, he feels something, but now he's not religious.
Interesting.
He's looking for something.
Right. So, I mean, I guess what I like about that idea of someone being not religious and writing a poem like this is that it feels extremely religious to me, right? Just religious in not the way you'd expect.
But because of his background.
Maybe because of his background, you know, it's
He grew up, as I said,
Right.
the conflict comes to the fore all the time.
right. Yeah, I mean, if we looked at a lot of Amichai's poems, we could probably put together different things because I think different poems suggest different kinds of connections to and distancing from religion for his speakers. But this is one that feels to me like finding a connection in an unusual place, about having that moment. Maybe not even having intended to. It seems like he stumbled upon this place as opposed to he was like, everyone's going to shul, I've got to put on a dark suit and walk to that store. You know, it seems like a thing that happened, but that it happened in this way that allowed him to have a religious experience in that moment. Yes?
This is came in his school, Jerusalem, 1967. Wasn't that Yom Kippur War?
Right.
We can't overlook what Sir was saying.
There's absolutely political.
This was a 6-day war.
It was the 6th day, right? Yeah. Right. But I think that he puts the date in there intentionally, right? If you include 1967 in the title of the poem, it's called Jerusalem. It's not just called Jerusalem generically. I think the 1967 matters, and he includes the Hebrew date as well. He actually, even in Hebrew, it's called Jerusalem 1967, and then he uses the Hebrew date in the text of the poem. And I think you can't overlook that there's political implication here, but it doesn't feel to me like a political poem that is distancing or even talking really about political conflict, but talking about a kind of unifying. And when you think about, I said to him in my heart, and you recognize what you started with, which is that I said to him in my heart could be God, but could also be the shopkeeper. You know, there's a sense of speaking across political boundaries and across religious boundaries. Both.
Reconciliation, perhaps, in some way.
At least an internal one. I mean, nothing really happens, but there's a sense of reaching out, at least in spirit. Yeah, Micha?
I don't see that. And
Okay.
What Sarah said spoke to me
More.
partly, and I think it's political, and it's possible that here he's seeing something with a sort of a resentment. I mean, you know,
Yeah, you read that too?
my father
Really?
had a shop like this, and if
nice.
not for what you all did, you know, that he would sell, the shop would, I mean,
Well,
other guys.
the you all did wouldn't work in this context, because we're talking about Europe.
No, his father is
Right.
a shop and they can give it back to the Nazis.
Yeah.
No, but it was in Israel, it wasn't in Europe.
I think,
His father had a shop in
There and here.
right, exactly. So even if we assume that this is not Amichai speaking, just the there and the here, I think that's what it is. My father's shop burned there, and he is buried here. I think that that's the important distinction. And also we have all the decades, right? So we're talking about decades earlier there.
Okay, but that's because somebody here knows that that's the fact.
No, I don't think that's why. I don't think that's why, actually. I'm not getting, I mean, you're saying that from the biography, but I think that's actually from the text. The decades and the there. I think you have to read that as being why I'm here.
I just.
Oh, you did? Okay.
That, in other words, it was there, I remember.
Oh, there, like right over there. Okay, now.
And my father was there.
Yeah,
This might
interesting.
be totally wrong,
Yeah,
just the way I would
right.
do it without knowing any
Uh-huh.
background. And my father was buried there. In other words, his
Right.
strong connection
Interesting.
to the land. And
Yeah,
maybe
interesting.
it's one of the first times he's there since the war.
Right.
And it's-
I understand.
And then the man, then I think the he at the end is, I mean, I take it, I don't know how he too could be
Right.
anybody but the man, because the first one is God, it's Yom Kippur.
But then who's the two?
The man, the shopkeeper,
As well as whom?
God.
Okay, good. So God's there too.
He,
Otherwise, there's no two.
but he, so that the Arab, in my interpretation, had no feeling about this at all. It's now, you know, he's been here for a long time. and
Right.
it's-
But why would he? Why would he have feeling about it? It's all, everything's occurring in the speaker's heart. How would the Arab, I mean, unless he were psychic, he'd have no way of having any feeling about this.
Nobody knows.
Yeah.
But not if you're thinking, my father had a shop like this, and he no longer does. Now, if it's in Europe, then it's an entirely
Yeah,
different
okay.
place.
Okay, it's different. Okay, so I'm going to ask a different question before we go to the last poem. And this is just one to think about, because this is very complicated. My question is, what is it about poetry in particular that allows us to have such different readings? Right? We share very similar backgrounds in a way. Oh, you can come up here and do it for me. But I think it's actually a question worth asking, because what we can do is spend our time puzzling out, I feel this way and I feel that way, and we can try to convince each other. And I think that that's a great activity, really fun and interesting, and allows us each to be enlightened by another's ideas. But I think, not exactly the same, but I think we could collect a much more diverse group than we've got in this room. Yeah. And yet there's something that we each bring to it. There's a theory of reading called reader response theory. It's also called reception theory, that suggests that each of us is a member of multiple interpretive communities. That's the term that they use, which means each of us has a set of experiences and things that we've read and things that we've thought and places that we've been and people that we've known, each of which makes us the reader that we are. And no matter how much we overlap, and we do overlap in a bunch of ways, we all have sets of interpretive communities that differ. And reception theory says that that's what leads us to read differently. And I think that's kind of interesting. And sometimes I try to pinpoint, especially when I have very different reading from my students, like what is it in my background that makes me want to find something religious in here? Maybe it's the way that I read everything, right? I'm looking for that little spark of connection, you know? So maybe that's something about me. Maybe it's just about the way I read grammar. It could be all kinds of things, you know, and then what is it about you that makes you find something more hostile or a little bit more unhappy in this poem than how I read it? So I think that's a really worthwhile question to ask too, so that in a way when you read a poem, and this is actually true for novels also, but it's easier to do with poems because they're so small, some of them are, you bring something to the poem, and then the poem brings something back to you, right? So you can reflect on that and think about what is it in the poem that's making me think about it in this way, right? And it says something about you as a reader as well. And I think that that's the way that I like to think about text, is there's a text and there's a reader, and we always have to meet in the middle. So it's not just us trying to puzzle out what the text says or what the author meant. And it's not just us sort of saying our opinions all the time. It's the two of them coming together, and when we meet, The text stays the same, but each of us brings something different to it, and that's where we come up with these different readings. So I think that that's worth thinking about too. I'm not sure that this is resolvable, or even that I'd necessarily want to resolve it, because part of the fun of it is, for me, to hear what other people say, because it enriches my own reading. You know, I don't know that it'll change totally, but then the next time I talk about this poem, I guarantee I'll talk about it in a different way than I did when I started today, because you brought something to me, right? And I think that that's sort of that dialogic idea of reading, that we can learn from each other, sort of keep creating meaning. But I really want to make sure we can get to the last one, which is in some ways the most difficult, at least in its ideas. It's also right in the middle of the 20th century, and it's by Derek Walcott. I won't tell you anything about him right now, but you can guess later if you want. And I'm just going to read this one to you. And like the Amichai poem, it's narrative. So it's telling a story. We would put the Hopkins poem, the first one that we did tonight, in the category of lyric, right? As opposed to narrative. Not that it has no story, but it's more song-like in its creation, and it bases itself more on imagery than on storytelling. So this one is also a narrative poem. So it's telling a story. The story gets a little confusing in the middle, so if you can't follow, we can do a little plot summary before we talk about what's going on here. A lesson for this Sunday. The growing idleness of summer grass, with its frail kites of furious butterflies, requests the lemonade of simple praise, in scansion gentler than my hammock swings, and rituals no more upsetting than a black maid shaking linen as she sings the plain notes of some Protestant hosanna, since I lie idling from the thoughts in things. Or so they should, until I hear the cries of two small children hunting yellow wings, who break my Sabbath with the thought of sin. Brother and sister with a common pin, frowning like serious lepidopterists. The little surgeon pierces the thin eyes. Crouched on plump haunches as a mantis preys, she shrieks to eviscerate its abdomen. The lesson is the same. The maid removes both prodigies from their interest in science. The girl in lemon frock begins to scream as the maimed, teetering thing attempts its flight. She is herself a thing of summery light, frail as a flower in this blue August air, not marked for some late grief that cannot speak. The mind swings inward on itself in fear, swayed toward nausea from each normal sign. Heredity of cruelty everywhere, and everywhere the frocks of summer torn. The long look back to see where choice is born, as summer grass sways to the scythe's design. Yeah, it's really good, I know. It's like really, really good. It's very dense and very rich. There's a lot going on in here, but at least one thing that I'd suggest that you notice is the repetition of imagery and how the images come back being used in different ways. So we have the butterfly and the yellow and the grass, right? And each of these comes back in a different way. Can you tell me the center story? I think that the bulk of the story is in that middle paragraph. By the way, we say stanza when they're all of the same length, and verse paragraph when they're of differing lengths. So these are verse paragraphs. Just, little fact for next time you're playing Trivial Pursuit. Yeah.
That's basically casual cruelty.
Absolutely, and that's what he's talking about. Cruelty.
Oh, yeah, to the
Right.
The praying mantis.
No, it's actually butterfly. What's the praying mantis here? This is why this poem is so hard. It does say praying mantis, but what's the praying mantis? That's a metaphor.
This phrase, I think it's just.
Saying the children like the mantis.
That's right, exactly. There isn't a literal praying mantis here. There's a literal butterfly. There's also a figurative butterfly, but there's only a figurative praying mantis, which is the child is crouched on her haunches like a praying mantis, okay? So it's really hard to pull apart. You almost have to, one of the things I recommend to my students when they're having trouble with the poem is writing it out in paragraph form, because sometimes the line breaks just throw you off. And you could write it out and actually figure out the grammar of each sentence. It's easier to figure out what's going on. So that's a tip if you're reading poetry on your own. But yeah, casual cruelty. Although, I think you have to ask, how much agency do you want to assign to small children? But they are being cruel, but it may be unknowingly cruel. It's not like adults torturing something. It's kids, and it's a kind of play that I think we're familiar with. You wouldn't say like those children in particular growing up to be psychopaths or whatever. We know that children do this kind of thing, even though we don't.
Well, let the doctors do it too.
Right, that's true. Fair enough.
This is the very quick. No, I.
But maybe not in this exact way. This feels a little crueler than the Lepidopterists, but
I'm not impugning the kids,
Right.
because kids don't know,
Right.
don't really focus on much beyond what they're doing.
Exactly.
With something like.
yes, they're very impulsive, and this feels like one of those impulsive moments.
But this guy's lying there. and
Yes.
It sounds like it's hammock.
Right.
And, you know, it's ruined his day.
It has, and then something else happens. But yes, what we have as the center story is these kids who are maiming a butterfly, right? Until their babysitter or their maid, nanny, stops them from doing it and sort of pulls them away. But it's changed his attitude entirely from what we had at the beginning to then what we have at the end. But I do want to see, does it ruin his day? Let's see. So what's he saying at the opening in the first paragraph? I think it's very intentionally over-the-top poetic, right? He's sort of trying to capture this beautiful, relaxing, right? He's showing you how many styles he can write in. It is almost a lyric poem at the beginning rather than a narrative one. The growing idleness of summer grass with its frail kites of furious butterflies requests the lemonade of simple praise, right? He's like, it's really flowery. And I think it's intentionally so. Not that he doesn't mean it, but I do think it's a little bit of play with language to play up this idea that he's at absolute peace, lying in the grass, thinking his lofty thoughts, right, and totally uninterrupted. And then this very harsh interruption moves things for him so that the mind swings inward on itself in fear, right? That's what we have at the end. And everywhere the frocks of summer torn. Now, dresses is another thing that we see all the way through here. So what are the images that we're getting of butterflies? What's the butterfly? We have the literal butterfly. What else?
The victim.
That's the victim, right? The literal butterfly is the victim. There are other butterflies here.
It's gossamer, it's frail.
Yes.
The girl in the lemon frock.
The girl herself is the butterfly. Now, why does he make that connection? Why would he say, here's this child tormenting a butterfly, and he obviously feels badly for the butterfly. That's where the whole thing is going. And then, right after that, he compares the girl to a butterfly. She's the one who is doing it. Why would he compare her to a butterfly? Her dress to the delicate wings of the butterfly.
It's going to be her turn in the future.
Yeah,
If you look at the last paragraph.
that's right. Who's doing that to her?
Society.
Maybe. I think something even more literal.
I was just thinking it's 1963. I'm not thinking of the summer, I'm thinking of the Black experience.
Ah, interesting.
He's in the Caribbean, right?
Yeah, wow, you know a lot about poets, yeah. He's, right, Derek Walcott is from St. Lucia. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't want to throw this conversation.
Oh, go for it, it's fine.
Yeah, but brother and sister with a common pin. This wasn't just a spur of the moment. This was more thought out.
Right, it's true, okay, so it wasn't just like we happened to see the thing, let's step on it. They had a pin. Although it's not clear where it came from. Did they go inside and say, let's get a pin and find a butterfly? Was there just like a pin in the bottom of her dress and they pulled it out and found, you know, you can't tell where the pin came from. Maybe they just found it on the ground. Maybe the nanny doing the laundry happened to have a pin and they grabbed one. You know, you can't, it doesn't seem, it's possible that it's really premeditated, but it's possible that it's not. You think they were like, let's go get a pin, I have an idea. Okay.
That's the whole notion, is that they don't think of it as a living creature. It's just something they're just going to do.
Interesting.
And with the Black
Right.
experience, what they did.
Oh, interesting.
And then they said, they're not human.
How much black do we see in this poem if we don't know who Walcott is? I think there's one.
Just the man.
Yeah,
Black man.
Right.
Somehow.
Yeah.
She's saying that gospel. That's a possible thought. Anybody could have a black man.
Right, exactly. So I'm wondering, do we see the children being black? It's not totally clear that they are. They could be. It doesn't say they're not, but they don't need to be.
The long look back to see where choice was born.
Right?
You couldn't black, the world can even turn around here with the white
Right.
kids suddenly have the black experience.
It's totally possible. Here's my concern about that reading, though. Are we just doing it because we know that Walcott's black, or is there something in the poem that's suggesting it? Because I think if he wanted to make it clear that this was a poem about civil rights, he could easily have done that. He's a very talented poet. He could have made that crystal clear. The only only reference to black here is the black nanny, and that doesn't feel like it makes the rest of the poem race-specific to me. But what the choice is a really important question. When he says where choice is born, I think is important, but to me, it's the choice about the cruelty as opposed to a larger political or historical choice. And I also put in 1963 for you, but you didn't have to know. Yeah.
I think it's comparing the butterfly who all of a sudden, without any anticipation, experiences this painful situation.
Yeah.
With the girl in the London frock, who not marked for some late grief, they cannot speak. But this young girl in the future
Yeah.
will have life happen to her.
That's right. Yeah, I would say that that's actually the player. So someone said society, I take time. I think it's time that's acting here. And I think you get that in the last line with the scythe, right? Because what is the scythe? I mean, obviously it's used as an actual farm implement, but it has a much bigger meaning for us.
Death.
Absolutely. And it's not just death, it's like the Grim Reaper coming to get you, right? Time's up. And so this feels very much like something that happens to him where in the first paragraph, he's removed from time, right? And we're in a place of almost timelessness. And then this thing happens, and what it reminds him of is the passage of time, and that it's going to happen to her too. She's just a child now, but by comparing her to the butterfly, and you can see how subtly he does this, right? By comparing her to the butterfly that's so suddenly eviscerated, right? To use that word, when he says the lesson is the same, right? There's a larger lesson there. At least he pulls one out of that moment. Not everyone would have to do that. You could say, those children are very annoying. That could be the lesson for you. But he makes it a lesson about life and about existence. And so you see how he's developed from the beginning to the end because of this thing that happens in the middle. But what I want to point out also is the title of the poem, A Lesson for This Sunday. So this is almost a holy moment for him. Maybe not holy in the way we'd like to think about it, because it doesn't feel entirely beautiful or purifying, but he still calls it a lesson for this Sunday, and maybe it's just, the sort of basic reading is, it was Sunday when this happened, okay, fine, but I think you gotta read more into it than that, which is that there's something religious about this experience, about remembering your mortality and the mortality of everyone.
I'm trying to think what was going on in St. Lucia in 1963.
Okay,
Yeah.
you could do.
It was like the problems we had in the South.
Lots of problems, different, I think, different from this, yeah. I actually don't even, was he living in St. Lucia in 1963? I'm not even sure if he was still there then, I don't know. He doesn't live in St. Lucia now, so he may not have been. But what I'd encourage you to do is find, I know it's so tempting because the poem's so hard and there's so much going on. And so what we want to do is say, like, what was going on in 1963? What was going on in St. Lucia? Who's Derek Walcott? What was happening in his life? Did he just get married? Maybe that says something. We want to do that, and I get the temptation, I really do. And what I would say is, you sort of pour that temptation back into the text and see what you can get out of the text. It's harder. It's harder to pull the text apart. But that's actually the goal, right? And what we want to do is grab outside and say, we need a clue. Someone give us a clue. And the clues are all there. And that's as much as you're supposed to get. That's the lesson for this Monday, right? is try to find what's in the poem. So this is a really rich one. I'd encourage you to continue looking at it. You'll find more. But you can see the way that the poets use these resonances to find holiness in a moment that otherwise doesn't feel so. Okay? And next week, we're going to talk about questions that poets raise. So I have 3 more poems for you, actually 3 in a little bit, and we're going to look at some questions that are raised in modern poetry. And see if you can get some more people to come, because this is really fun, right? Right, so you got to try to tell some other people. Okay, thank you. Good night.